Okay. Well, first of all, it's an honour to be addressing you all in Springfield and further afield. As you know, this is the 40th anniversary of the 1981 hunger strike. For my generation, it was our 1916. In 1916, as you know, the leaders of the Rising, the signatories to the proclamation, were taken out over a 3-4 week period and were executed by the British. In the case of our hunger strikers, 10 men lost their lives over a hunger strike which lasted for 7 months. And during that hunger strike, in the month of May alone, the British Army and the RUC fired 30,000 plastic bullets at men, women and children who were out in support of the hunger strikers. They killed children. They killed a good friend of mine, Nora McCabe, a mother of 3. They killed many and injured many other people in casual incidents, like for example in Beachmount Avenue where I lived at that time, 11-year-old boy was cycling down the street and a bored British soldier fired a rubber bullet at him and disfigured and blew his nose off. And of course, none of these killings from 1968, 1969 onwards, none of the state killings were ever accounted for. In fact, the British government and the British media never used the word violence about the early days of the conflict, when it was the RUC who were killing people, when it was the British Army who surrounded the lower falls, fired gas from helicopters into the area, shot dead 5 people, wounded another 70 people, arrested over 300 people, including 14, 15-year-olds. That was the false curfew. And this conflict, which fortunately has ended, thank God, this conflict was brought to us by the British government. And we found ourselves in the north of Ireland at the time of partition. We were an oppressed majority in our own country prior to 1920, but post-1920, we were an oppressed minority in our own country, in a partitioned 6-county sectarian state where every safeguard that was meant to protect us was removed by the Unionist government, which had one-party rule for 50 years, which discriminated against people in housing and employment and in our cultural expression, in our language, in the reporting of our sporting events, never appeared on television or radio. And to me also, one of the biggest scandals was the way that we were abandoned by the establishment in the south of Ireland. Now, as a result of the truce and the treaty of 1921 and 1922, and dissatisfaction within the Republican movement over that, the British government, of course, had divided and conquered, a well-known tactic of theirs throughout all of the possessions, colonial possessions in their empire. And a civil war was fought largely in the 26 counties of Ireland. And subsequent to the defeat of the IRA in 1923, many people of that period found themselves being discriminated against by the incoming Free State government. And many of those people were to immigrate to North America. Similarly, as a result of the 50 years of discrimination against our people under a single Unionist government here, one-party rule, many of our people immigrated again to North America to find work, to find home, to find happiness, peace and security. And it's ironic that those people and their children and grandchildren were the ones who came out and supported our struggle. It's ironic because from a unionist point of view, their discrimination, which was meant to curtail the numbers of the nationalist community so that we would never be in a position to demographically and democratically change things. They thought that by getting rid of these people, they had solved the problem. But it was a case of the chickens coming home to roost when our struggle started. Because it was you people out there who had memories of what had happened, who remained solid in their solidarity and in their support, and whatever way it manifested itself towards our struggle. And we grew massive, massive succor from that support. You have no idea of how important it was. You've no idea how important it was to the prison protest, to the prisoners who received smuggled letters from Irish American people telling them that they supported them. And the British government didn't know how to cope with the support from Irish America. Let me give you a small example. The New York Times referred to the IRA as guerrillas, and the British government, the British ambassador, wrote to the New York Times, said, stop calling the IRA guerrillas, they're terrorists. And even the New York Times turned around and says, they're guerrillas. We recognize that. And that recognition, by the way, of the political status of the Republican prisoners was also recognized by the British government. It was recognized after a hunger strike in 1972, when before anyone died, the British government conceded political status. It was called special category status. And this brought relative peace to the prisons. No prison officers were ever killed or attacked. I myself was interned. And although we had the British Army raiding our cages every 2 to 3 weeks, taking us out at 5 o'clock in the morning, putting us up against the wire, even though prisoners were died of medical neglect when they hit the emergency button during the night and no one would come to their aid, even though a prisoner, a friend of mine, Hugh Coney, was shot dead trying to escape from the jail, still in all, the special category status, political status, had brought relative peace to that prison. And the British government decided that it didn't like the way the prisoners were perceived across the world, running their own lives inside the cages with their own command structure, wearing their own clothes, studying. I passed English literature, A-level English literature, while I was interned in Long Kesh. And they didn't like the way the world viewed the political nature of the prisoners, and that what was taking place here was legitimate resistance to oppression. And so they decided, as they have done many cases before that, and they have done in many cases subsequent to that. We only have to look at the way they have reneged on the negotiations with the European Union and are repudiating the protocol. But they withdrew political status deliberately, even though the prisoners continued to be arrested under special laws, interrogated in special interrogation centres. They were allowed to be detained and interrogated for lengthy periods of time. Amnesty International and the European Court have shown that the prisoners were brutalised. For example, the men who were arrested in internment week, 12 of those people were taken away for secret interrogations. They were blindfolded and handcuffed and thrown out of helicopters. They were subjected to what was called white noise and mock executions. And they were found guilty by the European Commission on Human Rights. The British government was found guilty of torture. So they withdrew political status, hoping that because they could not defeat the IRA on the outside, on the streets of Belfast, in South Derry, in Crossmaglen, in the Bogside, in Tyrone, in Fermanagh, they could break the prisoners. They could get the prisoners to accept British rule, British supremacy, that the prisoners would accept themselves as a prison number. They would not be allowed to represent themselves. And the British government deliberately picked on what they considered to be the most vulnerable part of the Republican struggle, people held in solitary confinement. So they stripped these people of their clothes. They tried to force them to wear a uniform. They beat them to try and force them to wear a uniform, and the prisoners refused. And the only item in the cell that was left was a blanket. And so they wore a blanket. In Armagh prison, where women were not forced to wear a prison uniform, they could wear their own clothes. There, they also subjected the women to solitary confinement. They regularly punished them, withdrew remission, punished them for every simple infraction that they were involved in, every simple protest. Even, for example, on Easter Sunday, when the women prisoners in Armagh stood for a minute's silence, when they returned from the prison yards, the clothes were forcibly torn off them by male prison warders, and they were beaten and put into cells. Now, we had an extremely difficult time trying to get news of the prison protests out to the outside world. There was a lot of censorship involved. The British government said that prisoners were inflicting injuries on themselves in interrogation centres. I remember well writing out to newspapers, trying to get these stories into the mainstream media, and it was impossible. And it would break your heart. Every week we were getting small comms, communications, smuggled out of the prison, telling about somebody had their tooth knocked out last week, their nose broken, their eardrum busted, their fingers broken, black eyes, bruises. And the British government went so far as to put these prisoners on illegally under the European law, punishing them by bread and water diet. So every week or two, if the prisoner would not put on a uniform, the governor would come in and adjudicate and sentence them to a bread and water diet. And this went on for 4-5 years. One of the biggest breakthroughs we had was when Archbishop O'Fee, who later became Cardinal O'Fee, visited the prison, and he was aghast at what he had seen. He said, you would not keep dogs, you would not treat dogs like this. He says it was worse than the sewers of Calcutta. And that represented a bit of a breakthrough. Jay Adams and I secretly began meeting Cardinal O'Fee in 1980, and he then began to meet British Prisons Minister Humphrey Atkins. And those talks went on for some time. And around about August 1980, Cardinal O'Fee came out of 10 Downing Street. He phoned us to say the British government have conceded and the prisoners are getting their own clothes. He left Downing Street. He was flying to Rome to meet the Pope. And while he was in the air, the British government said, no, not their own clothes. They will be getting prison issue civilian type clothes, which the prisoners viewed as another uniform. And it was that refusal of the British to compromise in any way that triggered the first hunger strike of 1980. 7-man hunger strike for 53 days. I was involved in meeting regularly with Bobby Sands, who gave up his family visits so that I could meet with him. And I was also visiting the prison hospital. I was there with Sean McKenna, who I had been interned with in the early 1970s. Just as a sidebar, when the British government introduced internment on the 9th of August 1971, they had a list of names. They were working off very old intelligence, which was out of date, often arrested the wrong people. And when they came to the McKenna house in Newry, Sean McKenna's father was called Sean. And so they didn't know which to intern, so they interned both of them. So I had been interned with Sean. After his release, he was rearrested illegally. He was in a relative's house across the border in County Louth, and the SAS crossed the border in the early hours, dragged him into the north, where the RUC pretended they stumbled across him. And that's how Sean ended up in the H blocks, on the blanket, on hunger strike. On the 53rd day of that hunger strike, the British government sent a document to the prisoners. And in that document, they promised that they would implement a progressive liberal regime if only the prisoners would come off the hunger strike. And the prisoners ended the hunger strike and attempted to implement that document. But as soon as the hunger strike ended, and it was quite apparent to me from the attitude and the demeanour of the prison officers the following day, whenever I was up visiting Bobby Sands, and Bobby himself told me this, he said that they are gloating, they are triumphalist. He says they will not implement these promised changes. And again, we had the British government reneging on a potential breakthrough, which would have ended once and for all the prison protest. And instead, it triggered the 1981 hunger strike. During the hunger strikes, thousands of people have been marching on the streets. Marchers were attacked. Loyalists opened fire on peaceful vigils being carried out by supporters of the hunger strikers. And it was an incredible time. Those 7 months of 1981 were absolutely, in terms of what we were facing, the brutality, the intransigence of Mrs. Thatcher. She claimed that the hunger strikers had no support. And when we put Bobby up for election, and Bobby won the election and became an MP, Instead of using that as an opportunity to resolve the prison protest, Margaret Thatcher rushed through emergency legislation in the House of Commons to bar any other prisoner for standing for election. The hunger strike ended on the 3rd of October, and 48 hours later, the British government gave the prisoners their own clothes. They had got their pound of flesh. They had killed 10 hunger strikers. They thought that they had won. And boy, did they get that wrong. Thatcher herself had described the hunger strike as the IRA's last card. And again, they got it so wrong, because the lesson that we learned as an organisation from 1981 is that the British government, we could overturn and challenge their propaganda about the nature of the conflict, about the type of support the Republican movement had, particularly in poor rural areas and working class areas. And we decided to adopt an electoral strategy. And again, they did everything in their power to try and stop us from getting elected. Myself, Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness and several others were elected in the Assembly elections in October 1982. And we were invited to London by the leader of the Greater London Council, Ken Livingstone, who wanted, he said that the IRA bomb in England, if the government isn't going to talk to the Republican movement, I will talk to them. I want to have peace talks. On the eve of going to London, the British government imposed exclusion orders on us. And so in my case, for the next 15 years, I was barred from entering Britain, even though, by the way, they claim I'm a British subject and would be entitled to carry a British passport. If I went into England to make a speech, I would have been arrested and sentenced to 5 years in jail. And of course, the hypocrisy of the British government. In the very time that we were excluded, Margaret Thatcher was protesting to the Soviets about the exclusion of Andrei Sakharov, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, because they excluded him to the provinces. He wasn't allowed to come into Moscow. And you had these double standards. Again, our election candidates were attacked, were shot. We've had many councillors shot dead, including John Davey, who I was in cage 2 with in Longcash. Gerry Adams was shot. There were 4 or 5 attempts on my life. There were bomb attacks on our office. Our election workers were shot dead. And it was relentless, all aimed at stopping the electoral rise of Sinn Féin. But thanks to our doggedness, thanks to the fact that we know, as Bobby Sands, that we are right, that British government has no right to be in our country. It didn't have it yesterday, doesn't have it today, it will not have it tomorrow. And thanks to the struggle of the people here, supported, as the proclamation says, by our gallant allies and our people, or the Irish American people, and other members of the Irish diaspora across the world, we have reached a pitch where today Sinn Féin is in a dozen opinion polls, successive opinion polls. Sinn Féin is the most popular party in the 26 counties. And the biggest irony, of course, is that Sinn Féin has the most of all the parties in the north, has the most popular support. And under the Good Friday Agreement, this means that come next May in the Assembly elections, Michelle O'Neill will be elected First Minister. And what do we find from the 2 main unionist parties, the DUP and the UUP? They have refused to say that they will work under a Sinn Féin First Minister. They've been asked this in interview after interview, and they have refused to say it. And what we have there is the old mentality of sectarian triumphalism, where we are not equal. They still think they can treat us as second-class citizens. And the way they thought, and the British thought, that they would break the hunger strikers, boy, have they got that wrong. Because what is happening in Ireland, there's a transformation going on. The struggle is coming to a peak. In all likelihood, Mary Lou MacDonald will be the next Taoiseach of Ireland after the next election. And her deputy, the Vice President of Sinn Féin, Michelle O'Neill, will be First Minister in the North. And all of this grew out of a protest in Armagh prison and hundreds of men held in solitary confinement, being beaten over a 4 to 5 year period, hosed down, broken, beaten daily, denied every right, denied the right to fresh air, exercise, denied the right to go to the toilet. And all of these things were for nothing. All the suffering that the British inflicted on our people came to nothing because we rose above it. Because we know that Ireland is entitled, like every other country in the world, to its freedom. And that it's time for the Brits to go, and go they will. Gurmagov.
Danny, I'm not sure if you can hear the thunderous round of applause there, but everybody appreciate that that brief history. We'll just have time for a few questions. So I do have one here from Liam Smith, and he wondered if you could give us your recollections of the election in Fermanagh-South Tyrone and all the any stories you have that surround that, it being such a huge moment during the hunger strike.
Well, of course, Bobby was on hunger strike. He obviously was not available to do media interviews or to do any campaigning. And I was his nominated spokesperson, so I did all the radio and television, party political broadcasts. And I was also involved with the Fermanagh and South Tyrone campaign. Myself and other people like Jim Gibney and Jerry Adams went down to Fermanagh and South Tyrone. I have to confess that we thought we were going down there to teach them how to run an election, only to discover that they had been waiting on this moment for a long, long time, and that for decades, diligently, nationalists in Fermanagh and South Tyrone kept a record, put people on, as soon as people came of voting age, they put them on the electoral rolls. Because, of course, I mean, the area was often on a knife edge. Sometimes the different nationalist parties split the vote and a unionist would get elected. And that was also the risk with Bobby Sands. Austin Curry, who just died there recently, a former senior member of the SDLP, had threatened to run against Bobby Sands and had only withdrawn his name because Owen Maguire, who was the brother of the Frank Maguire, whose death had led to the by-election, Noel Maguire had put his name in, and by arrangement with us, withdrew his name, and we put Bobby's name in within an hour of the close of nominations. So it was we knew that Bobby's life was on the line. We felt, and the people felt, that him being elected with the status of an MP would present the British government with a predicament about an MP, allowing an MP to die in hunger strike, but also because he had this elected status, because of the manifesto upon which he ran, the British government, this could be their way out as well. They could turn around and say, okay, there's been a change in circumstances. It's obvious that the prisoners have the support of the nationalist community. That was a litmus test. Fermanagh and South Tyrone has shown that. And we will compromise and we will do a deal. And of course, they refused to do that. A lot of it down to the personality of Thatcher, but also, in my opinion, down to the huge influence of right-wing Tories and the Unionists, both at the level of the Belfast Northern Ireland office and the London Northern Ireland office. So we were down, we campaigned, people who were putting up posters were shot at by passing cars. Myself and Jim Gibney, we were canvassing small rural areas, little hamlets, little towns. We would be stopped by the RUC and the UDR, the Ulster Defence Regiment, and held for maybe 2 to 3 hours. Then they would let us go. Half an hour later, they would stop us again, take the car apart, all in an attempt to reduce our canvassing, all in an attempt to interfere with the campaign. all in an attempt to favour the Ulster Unionist candidate, who was the leader of the Ulster Unionists, a politician called Harry West. So it was an unbelievable campaign. I felt in my bones that Bobby was going to win, despite everything, including politicians standing up in the House of Commons on the day of the vote, when normally there's a moratorium on commentary, and getting up and blackmailing and bribing the people of Fermanagh-South and telling them they would be voting for murderers and terrorists if they voted for Bobby Sands. And yet the people of Fermanagh-South came out, over 30,000 of them, and voted for Bobby Sands. At the election count, whenever the returning officer was announcing the vote, and as soon as he read out Bobby's vote, I just couldn't help but let out a large yell. I was so excited and optimistic and hopeful that we could save Bobby's life. Whenever Harry West got up to speak, because it's normal for other candidates, including losers, to get up and speak, Harry West began reading from his victory speech. And he was some seconds into this when he realised that he had lost, when the Bobby Sands had won. He hadn't prepared a speech for having lost the election, because he was so sure and cocky that they were going to take that seat. So Bobby got elected. The media from around the world were there, from all over the world, and Thatcher remained intransigent, refused to budge. And there were a number of other interventions and statements made, but then Bobby died at 1:25 on Tuesday, the 5th of May. It was such huge news that news stations around the world broke into their normal bulletins to make an announcement. At his funeral, there was 100,000 people, including people like Father Daniel Berrigan, Ramsey Clark, former US Attorney General, people from all walks of life, culturally, politically, came to that funeral. And if Thatcher was looking at that, I mean, she knew she was staring defeat in the face, and still she went on to remain intransigent to ensure that another 9 hunger strikers died. And it was an incredibly emotional time. Although it's 40 years ago, historically the hunger strike has grown in importance over that period of time. I was up speaking at a commemoration in County Tyrone for Martin Herson, and young people today, I'm talking about like teenagers, they know all of the songs about the hunger strikers and the songs of resistance. In a way, it's incredible, and the pride of our people in what those prisoners went through, the courage that it took to stand up to that brutality. I remember we used to produce, after the death of Bobby Sands, we produced little badges. You may call them buttons in the United States. And Belfast was a gated area, a security area, where to go into the shopping centre, you were stopped and searched by the British Army and the RUC and the UDR. And kids wearing these would be stopped by the soldiers, take that off. And the kids said, "You try taking it off." And fights would break out. That was just another small element of the resistance that was there. Women formed relatives action committees, took over city centre shops, occupied them, refused to move. Even a woman from Ballymurphy was walking through Royal Avenue when Thatcher sneaked over to do a public relations exercise, and she was walking up Royal Avenue, and this woman, Mrs. Carson, started to shout out, "What about the prisoners? What about the haste blocks? What about the hunger strikers?" And they had to jump on her and try to take her away. So 1981 lit the fire, so to speak. We had been, from 1920 to right up until 1968, 1969, we were a vanquished people. We were second class. We didn't know how to get out of it. We tried peaceful protest. The price of peaceful protest was thousands of people burnt out of their homes. The British Army back on our streets again, allegedly to protect us. Within months, it was obvious that they were occupiers, here to protect the state, here to protect Stormont, here to protect the Unionists, here to protect British rule or British interests. And that's the conflict began after months and months and months of British Army brutality and British Army violence and British Army kills. And it was only then that the IRA came back on the scene again.
Danny, thank you. Danny, thank you. The next question comes from Steve Supernaut, and Steve's wondering if you can share with us some of your personal recollections of Bobby and the other hunger strikers.
Well, in terms of Bobby, Bobby was moved from one part of Longcash to another part while I was interned, and that would have been around January, February 1973. I think him and some prisoners might have been flown in by British Army helicopter. And I had an old school friend of mine, Danny Lennon, who was close to Bobby, was passing by our fence, our cage, and I waved to Danny Lennon and saw Bobby, but wasn't speaking to him. It wasn't until 3 years later when Bobby was released from prison. And by the way, the first time Bobby was in prison, he had political status, and he was only out of jail a short time before he was rearrested. So Bobby came into the Republican Press Centre on the Falls Road. I was the editor of Republican News, and he wanted to start up a community newspaper, and he was asking for advice how to do that. And we gave him paper and ink and kept in contact with him, and then he disappeared. I mean, back then, lots of people were being arrested, and it wouldn't have been unusual not to have noted it. But in prison, once he was sentenced, he started to send me out poems and short stories, which I published for security reasons under the pen name Marcella, because of the prison administration had known that a blanket man had a pen or a pencil, they would have raided the cell. And to put it indelicately, the prisoners carried everything up inside their bodies, up in their back passage. So they carried their pens, their tobacco, they even smuggled in cameras, they even smuggled in crystal sets where they could listen to the news and monitor the political situation. So Bobby had written out to me, and it was in 1980, in the build-up to the first hunger strike, that I was tasked to liaise with the prisoners. So I liaised with Brenton Hughes, the late Brenton Hughes, who was on the first hunger strike. He was the OC of the IRA prisoners at that stage, and Bobby was the PRO. And I liaised with Bobby and got to know him on visits and through his writings. He was an extraordinary person. You knew that when you were in his company, in his presence, you were in the company of somebody who was great. Despite the circumstances, you know, he had his own life in the palm of his hand. Nothing could intimidate him. He didn't balk at the fate before him. He was just extraordinary. And this was a quality, of course, among all the other hunger strikers. I mean, the 6 counties, remember, we were an artificial minority in the 6 counties, and yet we produced 10 hunger strikers and 30 others lining up to replace those 10 dead men. It just gives you a sense of the degree of the integrity of the struggle, the nature of the struggle, the nature and widespread nature of the struggle within that community, which had suffered quite a bit over the years, suffered like in terms of discrimination before they were physically brutalized and repressed. I had also been interned with Joe McDonnell, and the reason why I knew Joe very well was that I was born in Corby Way in a housing estate in West Belfast, and I was expected on Christmas Day but didn't arrive, and it was the 9th of January, and my mother decided to go to visit her mother, and she put on a false fur coat, and then she decided she wanted to go to the toilet. She went to the bathroom, she sat down on the toilet seat, and my head appeared, and she screamed to my sisters, go and get the neighbours. And among the neighbours that came across was Mrs. Healy. So Mrs. Healy and Mrs. Stanley came across and saw me being born on the toilet floor of number 17 Corby Way. And Mrs. Healy's daughter was Greta Healy, who ran around with my sister Margaret, and Greta later married Joe McDonald. The last time that I saw Joe was on Sunday, the 5th of July. The British government had contacted us again, and we felt there was going to be a breakthrough. 4 men had died at this stage. So I was allowed into the prison hospital to liaise with the hunger strikers and with Mick McFarlane, who was the OC of the prisoners. He was brought over to the prison hospital to meet me. I was given a telephone, which I could use to be in contact with Gerry Adams on the outside. So I went in and met the hunger strikers, and Joe McDonald was in a wheelchair. Joe had only 3 days left to live. We greeted each other. Sitting next to him was Mickey Devine, who would die on the 20th of August. Lawrence McKeown next to him, who would survive. Paddy Quinn, who would go into a coma and be taken off the hunger strike by his family. Across the table was Kevin Lynch from Dungiven, who would die in August. Thomas McElwee, who would die in August, and at whose funeral I would give the oration. Kieran Doherty was on my left. Kieran Doherty had been a year below me in school. His brother Michael and I were in the same class. So I was explaining to people that Gerry had warned me to say to them, this could be a false attempt by the Brits to raise up their hopes, only to pull the rug from under them and try and break the hunger strike. And they were well aware of that because of what they had experienced at Christmas, the previous Christmas time. And I went out to phone Gerry Adams. I told the prisoners I would be back. And I had just finished speaking to Gerry Adams when a prison governor called John Pepper burst into the room and said, what the F are you doing in my jail? Get out. And I said, I'm here trying to resolve the hunger strike. I'm here with authority from someone in the British government. And he says, get the F out of my jail. They brought 3 prison officers in, and I was put out of the jail. And that attempt to end the hunger strike also collapsed, and Joe died in the early hours of the Wednesday morning. So I knew, having been in jail with him, and then I myself was sentenced to 8 years and ended up in the H blocks in the 1990s. And the difference was extraordinary, the difference between day and night, because of course, at that stage, the British government realised they had to concede political status. They couldn't run the jail any other way without giving the prisoners this status. So whenever I arrived in prison into the H blocks, I arrived in H7, which is where the 38 prisoners had escaped from in 1983. I wore my own clothes. I had a typewriter in my cell. The first night that I was being locked up, the prison officer said, is it okay if I lock your door, Danny? And then he said, Ihawai, in Irish means good night. We didn't do any prison labour. I did an open university course while I was there. I wrote 1 novel and finished, or half finished, a 3rd novel while I was there. And the prison officers got on well with us. And that was as a result of them recognising political status. So the hunger strike, what the Brits did on the prisoners need not have been done. And it wasn't as if they were totally ignorant. We're going to take away political status here, and they'll just put on the uniform and that'll be it. They knew from 1917, when they tried to criminalise Thomas Ashe, who had also fought in 1816. Thomas Ashe had been rearrested and refused to accept criminal status. He died as a result of forced feeding. Terence McSweeney died, of course, famously in Brixton Prison in 1920. Huge funeral, like Bobby Sands was later to have, and other hunger strikers. So it wasn't as if they this was an experiment, let's try this. They knew that Republicans would resist criminalisation because the stakes were so high. If we accept that we're criminals, we're accepting that we're wrong and they're right. And the song goes, the famous song by Francie Brawley, that we would be accepting 800 years, that our struggle was 800 years of crime. And that was not true. And the British government put it up to these vulnerable people who they were able to surround in their cells, try and beat submission, beat them into submission, beat them into accepting we're the boss here, we're the sirs, you're a criminal. And they couldn't do it. Terrible, terrible price was paid, both inside the jail and outside the jail. 65, 68 people also lost their lives during those 7 months. Children, British soldiers, RUC officers, IRA volunteers on the streets were killed in active service during that period as well. And looking back from the British government's point of view, it was all for nothing, all for nothing. Because here we have a situation today where Ireland, the sentiment in Ireland, right across this country, is at its highest in terms of the demand for national self-determination, for us to decide our own future, for a new Ireland. And of course, North America, the United States, played a very, very important role in that, both at the time of the peace process, Bill Clinton's granting of an amnesty to Gerry Adams to encourage the process, Senator George Mitchell's role in negotiating the Good Friday Agreement, and even recently, the stance that Joe Biden and other congressmen and senators have taken on the issue of Brexit and the protocol to prevent the British government putting a hard border. Their easy way out is to put a hard border back in Ireland, is to jeopardise peace, is to try and make the North British again, something that it's totally running out of time on.
Thank you, Danny. And we have a good, sorry, I saw on the camera here, I have my back turned to you, as my father used to say, like a farmer counting his money. But we have about 15 or 20 more questions for Danny. We're not going to do that to him. This has been an absolutely fantastic presentation. Really, really appreciate it. We're a meal among it, Danny. So let's give a big round of applause.